Welcome to 10-Minute University Noontime Chat. My name is Sherry Shun, and we're going to talk about great garden trees today. This class is an offer of Clackamas County Master Gardeners, and it's offered in collaboration with and in support of the OSU Extension Service Master Gardener Program. These are my objectives today. I hope the presentation will help you know how to plant, place, and care for a garden tree so it will thrive. And I hope to introduce you to many excellent candidates for Pacific Northwest home gardens. In preparation for this presentation, I used as resources an Oregon State University Extension publication that's shown on the screen, Selecting, Planting, and Caring for a New Tree. It is free for download. And in addition, I drew ideas from 6 horticultural experts. Each person brings a different perspective, and I asked each to nominate 5 trees. So Paul Bonine and Sean Hogan are owners of nurseries in our area, and they both focus on climate-adapted specimens. Jane Hartline is owner of a native plant nursery, and that is her perspective. And Nancy Bewley is with a major company, J. Frank Schmidt and Son, which specialize in breeding of trees that are particularly tough for our environment. And they're used extensively in parks and as street trees, but they also do very well in gardens. Finally, to round up the perspectives, Richie Steffen runs the Great Plant Picks program, and his focus is strictly on great performance in Pacific Northwest gardens. And Martin Nicholson, who's the curator of Hoyt Arboretum, brings a global perspective to round out our list of trees. So let's do a quick review of what are the space considerations for placing a tree. To begin with, it's important to think about the space that's above and below ground. And it's also important, although very challenging for most of us, to estimate the future reach of roots and shoots. And I'll say a little bit more about that. There are a number of resources that can help us figure out at least a rough estimate of mature height and width of trees. The 3 excellent sources, I would rely very heavily on the first 2, the OSU Landscape Plant Database, which is free online, provides a huge amount of information about trees and shrubs that we're likely to find in our region with lots of photographs. And the tree book by Durr and Warren is widely regarded as the kind of the ultimate source. And finally, Trees to Know in Oregon and Washington. It's a OSU extension publication, and it's a wonderful field guide, smaller format, and it's something that you can put in your pocket or a backpack when you're out wandering around in the woods. The one thing that we want to keep in mind is size varies depending on soil and location. Let me give you one example. If we're talking about a redwood tree that's grown in coastal California, it can reach 300 feet. But the same tree grown in a Western garden is likely to reach maybe 100 feet. And if it's placed on the East Coast, it's likely to reach 50 feet. So soil location can have a great deal of impact on the eventual height and width of the tree. And it's also helpful to remember that roots can go far wider than the drip line. And they also tend to stay primarily in the top 8 to 24 inches below soil surface. So you might be thinking, well, where can I see some of these trees? Because many probably will be unfamiliar and you might not have seen them in your garden, or friends' gardens. So these are a number of the places where you can see them, and most likely larger, more mature size. Hoyt Arboretum in Portland. I listed the web location where you can put in the name of a tree, and it will give you on a map the location within the Arboretum. The second one is Oregon State University campus in Corvallis. I mentioned earlier the landscape plants database. It is a treasure trove of information. In fact, when you go there, not only will you see lots of descriptions about the tree and photographs associated with it, but you will also see locations of where to see this tree. It was quite impressive for me to go through it. The city of Portland has extensive survey and a huge database of the trees along the street and in its parks. And I also listed the website. So when you go to that website, it's really neat. You just simply, it's a GIS database. So you simply just clicking the area that you want to see more detail and kind of hover and zoom in on it. And it will in fact list the names of the trees in that geography, in that immediate street or neighborhood or park. And finally, don't forget, a number of the nurseries have display gardens. Sisters Nursery on Sauvie Island has a pretty display garden with lots of exotic looking, but very attractive looking plants. And the two major tree breeder and producer companies, Isley and J. Frank Schmidt, both are located in Boring and both have absolutely fantastic gardens. The J. Frank Schmidt Arboretum, I visited a number of times, wonderful specimens to look at. And Isley Nursery, the same thing. I think they do have requirements for you to check in before wandering around there. So be sure to look at their website and follow their guidance. One thing that's important about looking at trees before we add it to our garden is because when a tree is mature, its shape tend to be different from that when it's young. And since most of us are buying trees when they're much smaller, and then the tree will not reach maturity until decades later, it's a good idea to know what your tree is likely to look like. So these silhouettes are trees at maturity. And these came from the J. Frank Schmidt website. The OSU publication I referenced earlier also gives you a silhouette of tree forms and maturity. And the reason why I emphasize this is important is because when a tree is young, it tends to focus on growing upward, so it would stay fairly slender. And as it begins to gain height, it also tends to gain girth. And with age, the tree can become much wider in the middle and sometimes in the top. So it's really helpful to go to places where you can see bigger, better established trees. So one thing that I'm asked by people often is, do tree roots really attack sewer pipes? And the short answer is no. The tree roots will go where there is water and air. because that's what they need. And so they will penetrate cracks or weak joints in sewer pipes, but they don't really literally or physically attack the pipes and opening up holes if there are no weak spots. If you are planting a tree in a location where a conflict with sewer pipe is of concern, it's a good idea to choose a smaller tree, which will have smaller root system. And I looked through a number of extension publications for a list of trees that are kind of generally agreed upon as having aggressive roots and causing problems, conflict with sewer pipes. And I see willow, ash, poplar, cottonwood, sweet gum, sycamore, some of the maples listed quite often. But I have not been able to find anything that is strictly based on science and for sure prove the tree roots, in fact, are guaranteed to weaken or break your sewer pipe. So it's more by association. Distance makes a big difference. If the tree roots are farther from the pipe, it's less likely to have issues of conflict. And if they're closer together, more likely to have the problem. So far, it's more common sense. I have a publication from University of Idaho that's shown on the bottom of the page of this page here. And it does show a number of tree species that it recommends as opposed to the trees that they think are a problem. And if you look down that list, you'll see these tend to be smaller, medium-sized trees. And finally, I want to mention that some people think, well, to contain roots, we're just going to put a concrete or impermeable border around it. It doesn't really work because the roots are going to continue to grow as long as the tree is alive. And in general, roots tend to want to spread sideways. Remember, they don't go that deep. And so if you put a concrete border around it, the roots will just go either underground deeper or go above ground. So it's really not a solution. Okay, let's look at some other considerations, wire and structures. I consulted a couple of publications, USDA Tree Owners Manual and the International Society of Arboriculture's website has many publications. And again, there is, you probably suspected this, there is no science or true research to show what is truly a safe distance. In general, the bigger the distance, the better off. And so they offer guidelines for distance from pavement, buildings, other trees, etc., utility wires. But essentially, it's do as much as you can to avoid conflict. And obviously, these are not guarantees. So soil and water are also important considerations in placing a tree. We know roots need air and water in order to grow well, and we know healthy soil will support those to the roots, to the plant, but compacted soil will not. And we also know that in order to allow the tree roots access to air and water, it's best not to cover it with pavement or concrete. And if you need to put something over it, give it something that's permeable so water can flow through and air can reach it. And in addition, it's important to have a source of irrigation nearby where you place a tree, because we know at least in the first 3 years, that's considered the establishment period, we have to water the root zone. And we also know that some mature trees will need water during drought. And I think most of us saw that last summer. And another issue that often we do not think about is lawns and trees very seldom have the same watering needs. And because of that, although the image of a tree grown in the lush green lawn is quite appealing, it's not really a good idea. And finally, some trees like cypress and native oaks don't like summer water. So put a native oak tree in the middle of the lawn is a good way to guarantee its decline. And trees, some of them that you will see nominated by our experts can serve as windbreak or a source of shade. And if we want shade only during the summer, then we probably will want to choose a deciduous tree because sunlight will be able to shine through in the winter. So now let's begin with some small trees. Because I asked for nominations from both folks working in the nonprofit world and people working in the nursery trade, just to be fully transparent, for each tree that I'm showing you, I'm also showing who made the nomination. We'll begin with a 4-season tree, the fern leaf full moon maple. When I say 4-season, generally it means attractive branching pattern in the winter, pretty flowers, usually in the spring or perhaps summer, gorgeous foliage during the growing season, and then very striking fall color. So this tree is it's the first one of a group of trees that is a deciduous tree. And you can see that it's only 15 to 20 feet high and 10 feet wide. So it can fit pretty well in most gardens. And one thing that I put in the information box is whether the tree needs water in the summer. And of course, in general, if the tree's native area is receives summer water, then it most likely will need the same thing in our garden. All right. We're going to move through these trees fairly quickly. The Chinese fringe tree is an absolutely gorgeous specimen. It has the benefit of, again, the 4-season interest, really attractive branch and bark, beautiful spring flowers. It has fruit to feed wildlife, and it has beautiful fall color. I have seen this tree in bloom in a botanical garden, and it takes your breath away. And it definitely stopped traffic with just lines of people taking pictures of this photo. The crab apple is a relative of apples. It produces fruit, which is much smaller than the regular apple and is something that's enjoyed by wildlife. Now, this sparkling Sprite is one of the J. Frank Schmidt product, and it is a tree that is the result of roughly 40 years of history in crab apple breeding in the horticultural trade. And it's a tree that's grafted on a dwarf rootstock, so it tops out at about 12 feet high. And it has uniform growth, flowers that are bigger than others, colorful fruit, and is disease resistant. Persian ironwood and the cultivar Vanessa, or just a straight species. I've grown this tree. It is a very slow growing tree, so it takes a little patience before it reaches a good size and has its that you get the full benefit of the attractive form. It's a really sturdy tree, and Very elegant form. And again, 4-season features: fall color, interesting bark, beautiful flowers, attractive leaves. Crepe myrtle. I have quite a few of these in my garden because I'm a sucker for the colorful flowers. And they come in so many cultivars, species. And in the decades ago, when crepe myrtles first came on the market, there used to be problem with powdery mildew in the foliage when they're grown in our climate. But the extensive research and breeding by the US National Arboretum over the years has created disease-resistant hybrids, and the hybrids that came out of the Arboretum has spurred more work by the nursery trade. And today there is such a myriad selection in mature size, color of flowers, color of foliage. I just love these trees. And if you like to have one, I'm sure you can get one that match your size requirement. Ginkgos are an interesting tree because they're known to be really tough and extremely adapted, well adapted to environmental stress. So they lived ever since about 200 million years ago. So they're a kind of living fossil. And this particular ginkgo that is called Goldspire as a trademark is particularly narrow. So the slender form is considered attractive in gardens because often it's easy to fit it in a small garden. And also it is a nice kind of focal point. And you can see this narrow form in the fall color foliage is extremely attractive, kind of like a golden beacon. All right, next we're going to look at 3 Oregon natives. Beginning with vine maple, it is a native tree that grows in the understory of our native forest. And in fact, the name vine maple came from the fact that it kind of snaked its own way through the other plants in order to reach for light. It can be grown as a single trunk tree or a multi-stem shrub. And of course, when it's grown in a single trunk form, it will get taller. Multi-stem, the mature size will be smaller. It is a tree that prefers summer water and perhaps more shaded location, at least from hot sun. And I have seen a cultivar called Pacific Fire of the vine maple, and it has absolutely striking coral red stems. It's very attractive. Cascara is another native tree, deciduous, good size, faster grower, definitely, than the vine maple, and it offers tremendous wildlife benefits. The flowers will feed the bees, and the berries will feed many bird species. It also is a host for some species of butterfly larvae, and the bark is commercially harvested as a laxative. And the Western crabapple round up our 3 native trees. So the crabapple, similar to Cascara, the food for bees, or the flowers are become food for bees, and the fruits are feeding the birds and other wildlife. And in addition, it has a nice form, attractive green foliage, and extremely cold hardy to USDA Zone 5. Again, because these trees are generally found in moist locations in the nature. So if you grow it in the garden, it's a good idea to give it some summer water. So next, we're going to look at some small trees that are evergreen. And when I say evergreen, they're not evergreen conifer, but they're evergreen broadleaf. So this first one is tree mock orange. If you look at the genus Pittosporum, you would know, or some people say Pittosporum. It probably seemed familiar because there are many shrub forms of Pittosporum that are grown in local gardens. They're kind of marginally cold hardy, but they have very attractive leaves. This tree has very long leaves, 6 inches long, and the light yellow flowers are very fragrant in mid-spring. So it's a nice, new, different thing to try. The New Zealand lacebark is also a small tree that can look sort of like a big shrub, or it could be pruned to resemble more of a small tree. And it needs some summer water. And the attractive features are these fragrant flowers in summer, which is a time that's not common for trees to bloom. And it's native to New Zealand. And even though it's hardy to USDA Zone 8, it could lose some leaves in the cold winter. And this tree is less used in the United States, but quite popular in the UK. There are many kinds of magnolia. Some of them are large trees, and some are kind of big shrubs. And there are evergreen ones and deciduous ones. So this one is an evergreen shrubby form tree, but you can shape it by pruning in order to give it more of a tree-like appearance. Likes full sun, some summer water. And if you are new to the fragrant white flowers or other light color flowers of magnolia, do give it a try whenever you get a chance. They're absolutely fantastic, absolutely intoxicating. Loquat is another evergreen tree that has super attractive standout foliage. Again, the leaves are leathery, really tough, 6 inches long, and they also have fragrant flowers in the middle of winter. Isn't that just so wonderful? It's a great pick-me-up. If you grow a loquat in your garden, don't hold your breath for the fruits, because even though the plant is hardy to USDA Zone 7B, so it's hardy for the Willamette Valley, the freezing wind is likely to damage your fruit, and so you may not get a harvest. But I still think the form of the tree, the attractive foliage, the fragrant flowers, and actually the quite interesting trunk all together make this a worthy tree. So I snuck in a noble fir here. It's a conifer, not a broadleaf evergreen. And when you look at the photo of the parent plant, which was discovered at a nursery in Woodburn, Oregon, it does seem quite high. So perhaps the mature height is bigger than what we would consider is a small tree. But when you look at how narrow it is, it can fit in a really tiny footprint in the garden. So I put it in the small tree category. And I think this tree is kind of an interesting example of how some trees for gardens are discovered. They just, somebody one day noticed, hey, this tree looks different from the others, and it's a noble fir, but this is a noble fir that has a very congested growth pattern for the laterals, and it doesn't grow very fast, and it just looks unusual. And anyway, now it's propagated and sold in a large number of retail outlets. Rick's foxtail. Not sure what is the origin of the name and who Rick is. All right. Earlier, we talked about trees can be used for windbreak or shade trees. And many of the trees nominated by our experts fall in these categories. So let's take a look at windbreak. Incense cedar is widely regarded one of the best trees that can serve as a windbreak. Of course, there are many evergreen, broadleaf evergreen trees that can also do the job. But when you look at the shape of the incense cedar, it just takes so little space, yet you can clearly see that it will do a good job in breaking the prevailing wind. So this is a Oregon native. It's extremely tough. It's drought adapted. It tolerates poor soil, hot and dry site, and it is grown in various parts of Oregon. And in Southern Oregon, they're cultivated extensively, which allow the wood to be used for pencils because the wood is too soft for building structures. But supposedly the whole world relies on incense cedar from Southern Oregon for pencil wood. I found that interesting. But look at the cones. I think they're just so gorgeous. And they're not disease prone. And so what's not to like? All right. If you want evergreen tree that will provide shade, and this is kind of a deeper shade, not so much the dapple shade when you look at the photo in the upper left corner of the photo collection. Silverleaf oak, Quercus hypoleucoides, is a good candidate. In fact, there is a tree, there is one of this silverleaf oak that I found that's supposedly in Northeast 11th and Knott, Knott, in Portland. That's a designated heritage tree. I need to make a date to go see it. And it's also on Oregon State University campus. So this oak needs full sun, is drought resistant, needs little to no summer water. And the silver leaf, in fact, it's more sage green on top, but silvery underneath. And anyway, it's a tough tree, and it's used in Portland as street trees. Okay, this tree is one that I don't remember seeing. It's a hybrid of two genera. It gets the big trusses of flowers from Catalpa, and it gets the willowy leaves from the other parent, Chalopsis. So the product becomes a deciduous broadleaf tree, 20-25 feet wide and tall. And its probably most attractive attributes are these sort of pink foxglove-like flowers that come in trusses of dozens and bloom in the summer and can last for a long time. Several months is what I read. And if you think, wow, this tree looks really exotic, I will probably never be able to find one to see. Well, there are 6 of them in the OSU landscape plant database. So the next time I go to Corvallis, I'm going to look them up. And in the database, it tells you where they are, both on campus and in the city of Corvallis. Next, we're going to look at some wonderful shade trees that are products of J. Frank Schmidt and Son Company. So the first one is a maple that has green foliage, but beautiful fall color. And it has a nice pyramidal shape, very strong trunk, and highly adaptable to a variety of conditions. And the second one is a Tupelo that has a similar shape, kind of a pyramid, but slightly smaller in size, also fall color, also strong form, and disease resistant and tough, adapted for a variety of conditions. And the next one is a cherry, which I had mentioned earlier that that trees can come from a variety of origins. So this pink flare cherry is a selection that's raised from seed, originated from the north of Japan, or in northern Japan. So it has bigger flowers. It leaves out later, so you can enjoy the flowers without the leaves getting in the way. And it's a disease-free tree, which is quite unusual for cherries. And then it has really bright fall color. And it's bred to have this kind of narrow vase form. And I also really like that reddish brown bark. And the final one from J. Frank Schmidt is a Zelkova called City Sprite. Again, you get the feel for what they're breeding to select. A very stout appearance, kind of pyramidal shape of the canopy. And the City Sprite variety is slightly smaller, daintier. The leaves are more compact. And Japanese Swordia. This is a tree that I coveted for a long time, but I can never find a good place to put it in my garden. Take a look at the trunk. The beautiful structure of the branches, of the bark pattern, and then the flower, which is also fragrant, and the very glossy foliage. It's just a wonderful package. And this is regarded by Durr and Warren in their tree book as the most spectacular Swordia. Okay, so we've looked at a number of small trees, and now we're moving on to look at trees for sunny and dry sites. And some of these are native and others are non-native. First, we'll look at 4 natives. You probably are familiar with the Ceanothus California lilac. The genus includes many species and cultivated varieties. Most often they're shrubs, but they can also, some varieties or species can also be shaped into a small tree. And this is one example. So when I talk about this group of trees, periodically I'm going to mention they're best in lean soil. And I want to explain that a little bit. Lean soil means soil that contains very low organic matter and super good drainage. So the standard thing in the past in gardening is we take the soil and we amend it. We work it in order to make it richer, to have more organic content, because many of the plants that we grow come from places where that the soil may be richer, and they definitely get summer water. And so with that approach, we're going to get healthier, more robust growth in our plants. This group of plants are native to areas where the soil is lean, rockier, what we normally consider to be poor soil. And they also are accustomed to no water in the summer. So if you grow something in this group, beginning with ceanothus, you may water it in the summer when it's just growing, when it's just getting established. And but you want to stop when you get to the size of the plant that you desire. And no summer water is going to not allow it to grow as fast, and in fact will give you a stronger and more robust plant. The next one is a cypress. There are many species of cypress that are suitable for growing in gardens. This is a native. The non-native that we probably see a lot, or not a lot, but maybe more often, is the Italian cypress, which has a kind of pencil-like form, and it looks like an exclamation point in the garden. So this Cupessa, this cypress has really attractive silvery bark and silvery green foliage. And it goes extremely well with all the other Mediterranean type plants. And by the way, I found this at the Hort Arboretum. And I understand it's also at a winery in Dundee called Argyle. Canyon live oak is yet another plant that's native to Oregon and will do extremely well in poor rocky conditions. This tree will get bigger. It has very attractive kind of golden acorn. And there is a large specimen in Portland. I looked it up. It's Northeast 24th and Alameda. I'm going to have to go check that out. And the Oregon white oak is a iconic tree of the Willamette Valley back to the pioneer days. And it's also called Gary oak. And I should mention that oaks are widely considered as great for wildlife. The Oregon white oak in studies have been shown to benefit more than 200 species of wildlife. So it's not just insects and butterflies, but also birds and mammals and reptiles. And the other interesting thing I found, not that, well, hopefully we'll never use this bit of knowledge, is oak leaves and acorn are very high in protein content. So if there is a famine, we should all just harvest oak leaf and eat it. And apparently the nutritional value is comparable to alfalfa. Oh, so definitely if you don't want to eat it, it's good to feed your pets or livestock. All right, now we're going away from Oregon for non-natives, olives. You can grow them in this region, even though they're from the Mediterranean. And in fact, we can get harvest of the varieties that are hardy for our area. Again, they like well-drained soil and not too much water in the summer. And cork oak is just that. It's an oak that the bark is harvested for its cork. And this has been a practice by humans ever since the Roman era. Very much like the other oaks, acorn, beautiful leathery foliage. And I understand that it's used as street trees, Cesar Chavez in Portland. Channel Island oak is a native to the Channel Islands in California, but it also will do well here. And it's just beginning to be used as street trees in Portland. One thing about oaks is they tend to go deep with their roots. So they're very, very strong trees. And they also obviously are not thirsty during the summer. And the final tree is a snow gum, a eucalyptus. This is by far the best gum tree for the Pacific Northwest, according to 2 of our panelists. It's a tree that will get to a large size, does grow fast, but is extremely tough, very sturdy, and very attractive. And again, drought tolerant. All right, so if you are considering buying a tree, I want to mention a few things that I think few people know, which is a shame. The first thing is, if you want a bigger tree, do not buy a bigger plant to start out. And that's because the tree we put in the ground will not begin to grow as it normally does if compare to a tree that had not gone through the transplanting process until it has enough time to reach a shoot to root ratio that's comparable to a plant that was not transplanted. And so when you think through this, a smaller transplanted tree will begin to grow kind of normally much sooner than the larger transplanted tree. I read a number of studies, and the one study cited they had bigger trees and smaller trees and did the transplanting. And the smaller trees took, on average, over 4 years to get the roots to the size of pre-transplant in order to begin normal growth. But the larger trees took, I'm trying to remember, it's 12 or 13 years, I think 13 years, to get to the root size that would allow it to grow as before. So think about that. And if you begin with a smaller specimen, you're more likely to be able to have it resume growth sooner. All right, so if you're planting a tree, we have in Tammany University handouts and videos that provide a lot more details. But the few high points are, number one, the hole you dig needs to be no deeper than the root ball and much wider, so it should be a shallow bowl. And do not amend what you put into the hole. Just use native soil that's broken up. And the other thing is check to make sure the crown of the tree is above the soil level. Once we work the soil, break it up, and then water it, the soil is likely to sink over time. So be sure you plant above the soil level and allow for a little bit of that sinking. And this is something that we see often. A tree attached, or not attached, come out of the ground with no sign of the root flare. That's where the roots begin to go sideways. And so if your tree, in fact, goes straight into the ground with no sign of root flare, remove some of that soil, expose the root flare, and cut off all of those shallow roots. They don't do much for you because in the very shallow area, it's the first to dry out, and it's not most useful. And staking is another area where there tend to be poor practices. Trees should be staked only if it's necessary, and it should be staked low, generally in the lower 1/3 of the trunk. And it should be loose enough so you can allow the tree to wiggle. That wiggling is going to get stronger roots establishment. And the stake should never last longer than 1 year. And watering is something else that is not often practiced well. We need to have good amount of water to help the plant establish, which is the first 3 years. If you're planting the warm season, be sure to water it and keep the roots from drying out. If you're planting the fall, then there is less need for supplemental water. And often, if we're going to get a freeze in the winter, it's important to hydrate the plants before that because it allows the plants to be more resilient. And don't forget, evergreen conifers, they're alive year-round and they're growing year-round. So give them some water in the winter. And one thing that you hear a lot for how much to water is 1 inch of water per week. But I hardly know anybody who can figure out how much is 1 inch of water for any given area. So I think the guideline of 2 gallons per inch of trunk caliber is a much more useful one. And the trunk caliber is basically you look at your tree trunk and you figure out the distance from side to side. And this is what I'm going to do this summer. If we have any period of heat or no rainfall whatsoever, I'm going to be looking at my trees and keep in mind this 2 gallons per inch of trunk caliber and make sure that the root zone for those trees that need summer water is taken care of. And one thing that I do, instead of using soaker hose, etc., because it's so unwieldy, I just take the 5-gallon buckets, put them over the root zone. They already have a few holes drilled on the bottom, and then I just fill these buckets and they will drip slowly to wet the root zone. And finally, do use mulch. Mulch may not look the prettiest, I mean the arborist wood mulch as it's shown in this picture, but it's been proven by research to have tremendous benefit, especially for trees and shrubs, because they cover the soil, they provide carbon, which feed the fungi and enrich the soil microbiology. And this is mulch, so it's put on top of the soil, not mixed into the soil. And you don't want it to be piled up right against the trunk. You want it to feather to the trunk, but leave the trunk exposed. And you can use up to 4 inches, but research shows that up to 12 inches is okay. I know that sounds shocking. And I've listed a couple of resources. The second one is where you can get on the list for free wood chips. And the first one is the research from Washington State University. So to wrap up, we have an Oregon State University extension publication providing a lot more information on selecting, planting, and caring for a new tree. Lots of books. Sibley has, I think, 600 species. The tree book by Durr and Warren has 2,400 species. And then the Trees to Know has far fewer, but it's a wonderful field guide. And then finally, a website, iTree Tools, which has lots of interesting content if you're a tree gig. All right, I'm going to stop share and see if we have any questions.
Hey, Sherry, that was a great presentation. Yes, we have several questions. You talked a little bit about windy trees, and someone wants to know what the best trees are for windy areas. But instead of specific trees, I thought maybe you could tell them about the type of tree you might want in a windy area.
I think the best trees in the windy area, I'm assuming this is using trees as a windbreak, as opposed to just trees that can withstand wind. Well, obviously, for trees that can withstand wind, we want trees that can be strongly rooted. So it's less so what kind of tree, but it's the practice of planting properly and making sure that it has sufficient care and space to expand the root system. If we're talking about windbreak, both trees that are evergreen, broadleaf, and conifers can be good windbreak trees. The one example that I gave in the talk is nominated nominated by our expert. That's because it's a really narrow tree. So if you have limited space, you are able to break the wind and at the same time just have these narrow, skinny things.
Right.
I actually use, well, no, I know a lot of people use hedges, for example, to break the wind, but I think smaller trees actually are more attractive and would be over time, once they're established, require less care than hedges, which you have to kind of maintain by shearing, once or twice a season.
Right. And if we're talking about an area that's really windy, like East County out here, the faster a tree grows, isn't it?
So
weaker,
yeah, so
faster
basically you want slower growing trees that will tend to be stronger than the faster growing trees.
Okay.
However, and that's why the eucalyptus example that I showed is a good one, and it's useful to know because eucalyptus is a fast growing genus.
Right.
And so in general, the faster, the looser, and then the easier for chunks to break off. So I would go with plants that are stout, slower growing, and take your time to get something that is sturdy and long lasting.
Okay, great. We had a couple people ask about zone. Like this one person lives in zone 6 in Eastern Oregon, but they want to know about growing a tree that says it's a zone 5. So do you have to do anything particularly different? Also, could you explain the difference when you talked about a certain tree and if it said zone 4, what exactly does that mean in respect to other zones?
Wait, so what's the second part?
Well, if a tree says it grows in zone 4, what other zones will it grow in?
Oh, okay. Okay.
Like that.
Great. So the zones are set by USDA, and they basically look at the lowest winter temperature over 30 years, take an average, and that's how they determine the zone of any particular area. So if a tree is designated for zone 4, anywhere that is zone 4 or higher, you can grow that tree.
Okay.
It will be cold hardy. So a tree that is hardy to zone 5 will do just fine in zone 6 or 7 or 8.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, what if they want to grow a zone 5 tree in a zone 6 area? Is there anything particularly they can do to be able to do that?
Well, if you want to grow a tree that maybe is borderline tender for your area, then it depends on how bad the winter turned out to be. So you can, you seeing this news stories about like citrus growers, freeze is coming and they're not expecting that. So they go out and cover the plants and spray water on the surface in order, because that will help to kind of insulate it. So there are things you can do to baby a plant. But if it's a tree, I think that's difficult because anything that gets to be large enough will be quite a challenge, short of, building a nice greenhouse for it.
Right.
And in fact, people do grow citrus in large containers and then just wheel it in and out of a protected environment. So that's the ultimate protection.
Okay. This person says that evergreen forests grow without regard to the spacing of the trees. So will that work in an urban backyard too?
Well, in a forest, you can see if the trees are too close together. At some point, number one, they are shedding the lower branches, because where there is no light, there is no growth. So they eventually die off and it's nature's pruning. And the second thing is where the trees are too dense for the size. That's where we're likely to have more problems with insect outbreak, because the trees are stressed, so they're more vulnerable. And if it's in forestry, the foresters will actually go in and thin out the trees in order for the remaining ones to be able to grow healthier and bigger. But in nature, basically nature is taking care of itself. So there will be the natural thinning, or a fire can come in and burn off the whole area because it's so dense, and none of them are doing particularly well. So
Okay.
in a garden, obviously, we're the stewards. So knowing what a tree needs, I think as much as possible, we want to provide the tree a good start.
That sounds great. This person wants to know what the soil pH requirements are trees, and in particularly, they have crabapple trees.
Crabapple. I don't know the specific soil pH requirement, but most trees and shrubs, other than the outliers like rhododendron or azalea and blueberries that need really acidic soil, most of them are kind of toward something that's neutral. So probably around range 6.5.
Yes.
And I've never heard crabapple to have a particular pH requirement. So I think your native soil should be just fine.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, this lady wants to know and I don't know if I'll get these words right, the Catalpa tree, does it have long seed pods like the Catalpa tree does? That's that one that was a cross.
Yeah, right? I don't know. In the information I read, there was no mention of seed pod, so I'm not sure.
So how long they are. She'll have to look that information up.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. This question is a hard question because this person wants to be able to keep their tree small, but we are talking about an ornamental tree. So they want to know about pruning. Is it important to keep the tree pruned every season in order for the tree to put out more effort into the girth of the tree? She would like to keep her tree smaller while still allowing the beautiful yield. And then she wants to know what percentage to prune off. But we're talking about ornamentals here and not.
Well, so this is ornamental, but then it's the producing what, flowers?
Well, I think she means the flowers, the beautiful foliage and whatever.
Okay, so if you're pruning a tree with flowers, you would prune the tree after flowers are done, because that's one of the highlights. And the percentage you remove, the general guideline is no more than 1/3 every year. So if you're pruning just once after the flowers are removed, no more than 1/3. And if you're trying to prune something in order to keep it small, yeah, you can do it, but it's an annual forever commitment. And I would say don't prune too harshly, because obviously pruning is inviting the plant to respond with lots of new growth. And if the tree flowers in spring, you're likely to get a more robust response from a spring pruning. But if the tree flowers in summer, then you're likely to get a lesser response, because the tree is already, kind of done its growth.
Right.
So summer pruning is going to give you less of a new growth, vigorous response from pruning, and that may be better if the goal is to keep the tree smaller.
Okay, but you can't necessarily take a tree that its normal size is 30 feet and keep it at 10 feet. I mean, that's like an impossibility, isn't it?
And yeah, it will be very difficult. And it will be very difficult. So I would say if you really want a tree for a 10-foot space, then you should get a tree that's, that eventually is going to get to 10, 12 feet. Like, there's that crabapple that's genetically bred to be just 12 feet and no bigger, and it's a nice umbrella and all that. So, the nursery trade had done a lot of work for us. So it's important to get something that's going to take less manipulation.
Yeah. And this gentleman wants to know, and he loved your idea of the bucket and putting the holes in the bottom. How big are holes?
I use really small holes because these buckets are intended as, think like drip irrigation.
Yeah.
So when you think about these little drip lines and how much water comes out of those drips, that's what I aim for. So the water takes a long time to go through.
Right. Okay. And what about a new tree where the top is leaning over due to the wind? And they said they were going to stake it real high, but that doesn't sound like they shouldn't probably do that from your talk.
Yeah, it's a new tree with a top that's leaning. Well, if you just stake it 1 year, the reason for staking lower is you want to allow for wiggle. If you stake too high, you take away the ability of the tree to wiggle. And that impedes the development of the roots. So I would say if you're really afraid that you're going to have problem with the leaning tree, it's something that you may be able to correct over time as it grows with pruning, selective pruning.
Right.
And I think I would consider that probably before I stake it too high.
Okay. This person wants to know that should they remove flowers and other plants that grow beneath the trees? We see a lot of trees that have other plants growing around the bottom.
Yeah, some trees are used to having an understory planting with them. If you go to a forest, for example, you can see, Doug fir underneath, maybe huckleberries and salmonberry and then fern. So you can see the natural kind of combination of layers of plants that get along really well together. You can try to duplicate that in your home. If you're growing a non-native tree, you want to think about what other plants will do well under or close to this tree. And that should be plants that have similar cultural requirements, probably from similar, regions or similar climate regions. And again, so those are good guidelines to use.
Right.
But the important thing is tree roots tend to be pretty shallow, so it's a good idea not to do too much cultivation, because if you're growing other things and you're constantly stirring up the soil, you're damaging the tree roots, and that would not be a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I know as master gardeners, we're not supposed to be specifically give out information on where to get certain things to buy them, but this person knows where to get these trees that you've talked about. They've looked for the evergreen oaks, but haven't been able to find them. And I know you gave a lot of information, important information about certain nurseries. So
I know that I'm not sure which oak that they're talking about that they're looking for. Yeah. And I do know the two nursery owners that recommended trees here, both Cistus and Zira. Yeah. I know Cistus have a lot of oaks. And I know oaks are being used in the city of Portland as street trees. So I know there are places to get these oaks.
Yeah.
And I also know the big tree grower in Oregon is Gosler Nursery in Springfield. It's Gossler. And I haven't looked at their inventory lately, so I'm not sure if they're growing oaks, but I believe they can be found. And if you don't find them, go ahead and call, Cistus, Gosler, call the nursery trades, because these people are so generous and there is a definite camaraderie among them. And I would say, don't be afraid to even go to your retail nursery and just tell them, I'm looking for such and such, and can you help me find it? And usually the nurseries will carry a limited selection because that's what they know most people will buy. But it doesn't mean if it's not in their inventory, they cannot get it for you. I know the wholesale growers like J. Frank Schmidt and Isley, I recommended their places in Boring to look at trees. I know they have trees available, and if a retail place will call them and ask for a certain tree or shrub, you can get it. They'll be responsible to get it for you, and you just pick it up from the nursery. Right. I've done that.
And the Oregon Association of Nurserymen also have lists of nurseries in our area.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, OAN has a good website, and they have their retail nursery members. So lots of information. Don't be afraid to, just ask around. And, if we only ask for 5 trees, that's all we're going to get in our nurseries. And the shocking thing is the city of Portland's extensive inventory of street trees that I looked at, 1/3 of the street trees in Portland are made up of 5 kinds of trees: flowering cherry, flowering plum, flowering pear. Norway maple, which is a horrible tree, and red maple. That's it. We don't have enough diversity. And if anything, I hope folks who are here, if you're not adding a tree to your garden, that you do talk to your parks department people who are responsible for choosing what trees go into the parks. People who decide what kind of trees can go along the street in your city. And, tell your garden club members and your friends and neighbors that there are all kinds of wonderful trees out there waiting for our discovery. And we can help with the biodiversity by having more different kinds of trees in our gardens, along in our parks and along the streets.
Yep, sounds great. We just have one more question, and they wanted you to comment on keeping trees in pots for restricting their growth, if that's possible.
It's possible. The trees that naturally have a smaller size will do better, will be easier to manage. And one definite that you have to do, get a big pot to start out, but also you need to periodically take it out of the pot and root prune it. So you don't want to allow it to grow to a condition where the roots reach the edge and circle, kind of what we have seen in nursery grown plants that are sold, 50% off because it's way off the season. So we don't want to allow that to happen, because so it takes some work, but it can be done.
Okay, well, that's all the questions. Do you have anything last minute things to say, Sherry?
Be an advocate for diversity in trees. I am convinced different kinds of trees are going to do better good for the resilience of our ecosystems, whether it's our yard, our community, or our parks and cities. So thank you very much for joining me.
Very good. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you, Sean. See you next week.
Bye.